Hey Creagears, Robo here, and welcome back to our latest episode in this Salmon Custom Amiibo month. Finally, we're now 4 videos in, officially over halfway through our leftover customs to make.
Are you with me?
Yeah, so let's show you guys how this one and the one from next Wednesday became the hardest customs to make this month. Instead of our usual start of making the clay parts first, we actually had to start with some solid pieces. Since both of the custom amiibos of this week had to have those clay parts molded around these solid pieces.
Bino! You ready? Ready?
But back on track, as you saw, we used some granny grating to make the base of the grates that we're going to use to place a steel eel onto. Otherwise it would have never fit onto a normal amiibo base.
Bino!
But these two parts of the base were then glued to each other, and then some railings were added using some coffee stirring sticks. Some halved ones for the top of the grate, and then some whole ones for the sides, since those could use a little lift. The next thing to make was the card of the salmon. For this we started with a halved wooden sphere that we got from some pawns at the craft store. And this was then glued to a square chopstick which we attached at an angle. Then we used the lid of a paint container to make the imprint of a circle to cut out the wheels. This was then repeated on both 2mm and 5mm EVA foam. And both circles were then halved to combine one of each to make the wheel and the wheel cover. But in the end, these wheels weren't too much to our liking, so we decided to make some new ones. For the tops, we still used the same technique for the 5mm EVA foam, but for the bottom part I actually used the rounded ends of some popsicle sticks. And then a larger bead was added to the snip chopstick to later thread the wire through. Then with the parts done that would interact with the clay, we could start on some epoxy sculpts. Starting with a thick snake of clay that we then skewer onto a piece of aluminium wire that we had glued into the halved sphere. This will then make the base of the salmon. Next, the face was flattened horizontally, since this will later be covered by a signature face mask. Then we could make the two fins and place these onto the figure, and using some super glue we also attached them to have him hold the bar of the card. Then his large eyes were added. And the stamp that we made for the scale imprints was then used on his back, and those were actually all of the details of the salmon. Except for some eyelids that were scored onto the eyes when the clay had firmed up a bit. Next we finally started on the face of the steel eel. For these parts we actually wanted to try a material new to us, plastic art. A sheet of plastic that can be easily scored to release some very nice straight pieces. Perfect for the head of the steel eel. We had already done some experimenting with some paper patterns off camera, so all we had to do now is cut out the pieces. Then after all of the parts were released, we could use a heat gun to heat up the parts of the plastic that we needed to bend, like this nose piece and the chin of the steel eel. Then we could use some plastic glue to fuse the loose parts. Because with this glue, instead of just fixing the parts together, it actually melts the plastic to create a stronger fused seam between the pieces. This way we end up with two nice pieces of the head. To which we can then add some more details, like the grills on the chin of the steel eel. And also some really small screws for the screws on both sides of the head. But for this we first need to attach both halves. So using some pieces of popsicle sticks as spacers, we glue the two halves together. Then we drill the holes on the sides for the screws. But let's leave those off until we're done with the painting. But to finish the head we still need those iconic eyes. So, same as with the flipper flopper, we start with one of those wooden pawns again. But this time we actually leave the bottom part on to have somewhere to grip while we drill out the middle of the spheres. Then, starting with a smaller drill bit, we creep up to the final 8mm holes that we're going to need. Okay, 8mm plus with all of the rounding. Then some sanding to get the fuzz out. And finally we get to release the spheres from the handles. Then some more sanding and we get some nice eyes. Which now only need a slit where the LEDs are going to poke out. But to compromise for the more slit-like lights that the Steel Eel has, we sanded the LEDs to hopefully make the light more like the game. But since these guys will be closed off, we do need a black background for the LEDs first. But once those are added, we can use a lot of hot glue to secure the LEDs in place and also make a diffuser for the lights at the same time. Then, as the final part for the head, we add the holes for the whites of the eyes. After which we can also make a support piece on the inside made from some foam board. And to these we can then add the hydraulics that link to the wheel at the bottom. Made from some different sizes of bamboo skewers and some 5mm EVA foam respectively. Next, we could start on the part that really threw my head for a loop, all of the segments of the Salmon boss. At first I wanted to make these segments from some 6mm plywood that I can then sand and cut to make the X indent on the front and the handle with some more bamboo skewers. But as soon as I got far with those, I saw that all of the fuzziness of the wood just wouldn't go away, even with a lot of sanding. So I had to break my rule of only using readily available materials to save the end result of this custom by using some resin 3D printing. By using this I was able to make the segments into two parts, the jerry cans on top and the circles at the bottom. This also allowed me to make some space in the middle for the LEDs that we're later also going to add. But for now, we first get the task to clean up these prints by first removing them from the supports. Before I could sand and wash the resin powder off these parts. Also firmly drying those parts to not let any residual water warp the pieces. Quite a few Amiibo bases have been warped that way. Which also allows us to have a little preview of how the parts are going to work. Quite nicely designed if I do say so myself. Finally, we get to finish these stupid segments by soldering all the wires together. For this I decided to wire up all the LEDs first, and then have them added to the chain one by one. This made the task a little bit less chaotic, but still a pain in the ass. By needing to check the polarity of each segment and the battery to not have short circuits. The small workspace that we always have with these LED amiibos. And on top of that, I ran out of big green LEDs, so I only had enough for the first 3 segments, before I had to switch to some smaller ones. I really wish this was a hard project. But at last we got all 7 segments together. And I know what you're going to say. We know. But we didn't have the mental capacity to do this for almost twice as long for this one chaotic amiibo. Finally, we get to finish the building phase by adding the accessories to the driver. Starting with his mask. Made from some craft paper, which was then squeezed in between the face and the cart. Then some fishing wire is used to make the band that holds the mask. And finally, his back fin is added from some 2mm EVA foam. Then it's finally painting time. So after having already applied a black and white base off camera, we can start on some salmon grey for the body of the driver. Getting into all of the nooks and crannies behind the fins, and also not forgetting about his eyelids. Then a dark gunmetal is used for the cart. On most of the head. And using a lighter coat on the bristles, we also dry brush the metal color onto the circle segments. Then all the leftover places get painted with a bright silver paint to distinguish them from the other kinds of metal used for the steel eel. And this silver was then also used for some extra details on the cart, same as in game. Then a light olive grey is used for his eyes and his belly. Then we can grab our saturated green acrylic paint again and use another 4 layers to color all of the jerry cans. Then we could go over the mask with a titanium white. Also very carefully adding it to the strings of the mask to make them stand out from the skin. And after that has had a chance to dry, we only need to add a pure red for a pattern that you can actually barely see in game, but we still need to add. This pure red was then also used for his irises, together with a black for his pupils. And at last, a light grey is then dry brushed on the bottom of his skin to add a little bit more action to the body. Finally, we only need to struggle one more time to get every part of the amiibo in place. Luckily, the start of attaching the painted grates to the base isn't too hard. Same as with adding the driver to one end of those grates. Through which one of the ends of the wires is threaded. But before we can start on the harder parts, we actually have one more thing to make, the jets of water that the steel eel shoots onto the ground. Finally, we get to do some water effects on an amiibo. So for these, we put 3 jets of hot glue onto a sheet of parchment paper, with a connection on the bottom. This was then repeated 6 more times to get the 7 sets of jets. But by making them on the parchment paper, it does leave kind of a flat side on the back. So one more layer of glue is added to beef up the jets. Then, after all were made, we get to attach them with some more hot glue to the bottom of the segments. This way we get a seamless connection by fusing the glue together and also diffusing and guiding the light through the LEDs to the rest of the water. After which we get to start on the annoying part, assembling all of the steel eel. So for this we started by threading the other end of the wires through the bead, before we started to add even more hot glue to the bottoms of the jets to attach them to the grates. So one by one each was attached with this weaving pattern to get as much of the steel eel onto this amiibo as possible. To which we can then finally add the rest of the jerry cans to close off these ugly connections of the LEDs. Then the final connection of the circuit is tested and soldered together. So now we even got some working lights on this amiibo. And with all of that finally finished, all we've got left is to add the green transparent paints over all of the water effects. So both on the jets of the segments, and the water or glue that holds the grates to the base. With also some painted splashes onto the wheel and the bottom of the card as collateral. Then all of the transparent paints get sealed with a gloss varnish. And a matte varnish is actually used for the greens of the jerry cans to get more of an even coverage and to protect them. And with that, we can finally announce the Splatoon 3 Next Wave Steel Eel Custom Amiibo finished! Hey Creagears, Robert here, and we hope you found our latest custom amiibo a fun watch. So, now we only got 2 more amiibos left, the Drizzler and the Scrapper. Any guesses on who's going to be the one we're going to make next Wednesday? Leave your guesses down in the comments. But that's going to be all from us for now. Keep those Creagears turning, and we will see you guys in the next video.